All right. Welcome to the May 7th Istio community meeting, or not community, working meeting. Looks like we've got a few items on the agenda. Two of them seem to be related to service scope. The same pull request listed there. And then we have some questions about verifying TLS. And 126.0 release is tomorrow morning. That's exciting news. Daniel, I'm going to bump this up to the top. Anything else you want to speak to that?
Yeah, great idea. Up to the top. Actually, Daniel is here. Okay, good.
Sorry, I was trying to find my mute button. The only thing really outstanding is the TOC Envoy filter note that looks like Keith and Lynn have started talking about, but we're going to be starting it in the morning European time, so we can make sure Craig's around as well. So by the time the US folks are around, hopefully it's out and published.
Okay.
That sounds good.
Awesome news.
Yeah. Do you need any help from anybody to help release? Is Craig writing the release blog?
Yeah, he already wrote the feature portion of it, but I put something in the contributors channel. Maybe it didn't get seen, but if anyone wants to take a look, the PR is open already. So if there's a feature that you're aware of that probably should get a shout out, I would suggest adding it today to the PR, and I can link that if needed.
Yeah, if you add the link to the meeting minutes here, that would be great. Thank you.
Oops, all right. That's all I have.
All right. So next up, we've got these two items on service settings. I see Jackie's name on one of them. The other doesn't have a name. Jackie, do you want to walk us through the conversation here?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that another line had been added. So I'm not sure who added that one, but I didn't notice that, so sorry. But just wanted to share an update based on our discussion last week. I was able to catch up on that. So thanks again for everyone who reviewed that while I had to drop early. But I've tried to go through, there's been a lot of discussion. Costin's given a lot of great feedback. So I've tried to go through and make sure that I understood his feedback in general, and I'll let Costin speak for himself. But in general, it's just making sure we have very clear documentation and what use cases defining a service scope with label selectors is useful or is secure for a user and then isn't secure. So just understanding and really documenting explicitly the implications of using these label selectors and what that means for users who want clear boundaries, between their tenants or whatnot. If they want clearer boundaries and clearer, maybe a more strong security posture, they maybe this isn't the right solution, or it's the right solution, but there's additional work that they need to do on top of simply setting a more global label. So it's just making sure we have more documentation. Additionally, I also responded to kind of the feedback that we got to align more with the ambient enablement API, or not API, but design that kind of Mitch put forth in, I don't have the exact PR, but that has since been merged. So I have a comment kind of going through what it would look like to configure the service and namespace selectors in the most common use cases and how it would align with the enablement API usage. So we can take a look at those, or if people want to take a look at those offline as well. But Mitch, you can scroll to that comment. I think it might be above. Okay, go ahead, Costin.
Sure, I want to add some comments afterwards.
Sure.
There's a lot of comments. Which one are you hoping I'll scroll to?
The one I added about the enablement API. It should be further down. Oh, now we're at the top. Sorry. I added the specific link in the meeting notes if that's helpful.
Is this what you're talking about?
Nope, it's further down. Yeah, this one here.
Okay.
Yep, so these are just the examples for the common use cases. Lynn, I want to make sure that this addresses some of your concerns with, also supporting a namespace selector. I think the way that Mitch has designed the ambient enablement API and anding of the service selectors and the namespace selectors, I think simplifies the usage of a namespace selector. But yeah, I want to make sure that this addresses some of your concerns.
Sorry, just catching up on this, but I'm looking at it right now. By the way, I have a question. So apologize, Mitch. I think I was asking to review your enablement, and I forgot connecting the dots about auto enrollment and the label.
No worries.
I do understand why we need to, the user cases, why somebody might want to customize the ambient enrollment label. For this one, what's the user case if somebody wants to customize the global label? Is it because maybe there's a different platform that may be supporting a different label?
What we talked about last week, Lynn, was there are sort of two different models. There's an opt-in and an opt-out at a high level. Some users will want to say by default, every service is global. But if you don't want your service to be global, you can do some labeling on either the namespace or service to opt out. Other users will want to say by default, every service is not global and needs to be explicitly labeled either at the service or namespace level to opt in. And even when you talk about opt out, there's probably also some namespaces you want to automatically opt out. Infrastructure namespaces, cube system, that sort of thing should be selected by label to always be opted out. So the idea here is to allow for all of those use cases. And I think it's important to note that in terms of who would be editing these label selectors on a regular basis, we're not expecting that would be your average user's task. This is like a very experienced mesh administrator or a vendor who would be setting these. Others will simply use templates. Okay. And we've got a few templates listed here that they'd be able to select from Helm.
So so I understand the need for label. The customization of the key, is it because we want to save the user from requiring to label istio.io/global/local on the namespace when the namespace may already have a common label they use for the class?
Yes.
Okay.
For instance, if they're using MCS today, they're already using some arbitrary label selector within MCS to indicate what services should be exported. They can just adopt that label selector here, and Istio should carry forward the functionality of MCS effectively.
Okay.
And that's a common pattern. That's a common pattern basically to have a selector specified by user. Service as a selector, everything as a selector is not usually good to define the Istio labels as magic.
So is your comment to say the label, the customize of the key are not very common, and
it's very common to have a selector basically to allow user to have a selector for everything instead of hard coding some keys. That's usual practice in the places.
Yeah, selector, I agree, it's very common. It makes sense to support. I was just trying to understand the customization of the key, just making sure we understand the user case, because it adds a little bit of complexity if we allow user to customize that, and also what is the default key. So that opens that question too, because now I'm seeing there's two potential default key, one's global, one's local.
I'm not sure if there was a default key. My guess is if you didn't specify anything, so if you just had an empty service scope, everything would match. So everything would be considered global. but maybe
I
that.
don't know, Jackie, I
no,
don't know
no,
if
no,
we're talking
no,
about default in terms of empty in Helm values. I think we're saying, what are we going to set the value to in the Helm values file?
Oh, I see. Got it. Okay,
Yeah,
And I think the
default,
idea here is that that would be number one.
sure.
so default cannot be global by default. I mean, that's the default in Sidecar, I know, but we kind of agreed that this is not the same value for a user who installs by default. So if you enable ambient by default, you cannot have global by default because it's breaking. You can only have global and user label selector in two cases. One, you do not have security policies and you trust everyone equally. So basically the namespace owner is basically can make a decision about if they can expose or not expose.
Mhm.
And second, if you tested all the application or you have some mechanism, your entire mesh is tested to have only global databases and global state. If you are one of those organizations, you can enable default, but that's not a common case. Not very few organizations have this level of testing, control, and discipline to not use any local database. The problems that I want to confirm, and there are a lot of back and forth with Kit and others, and is that the label selector scope is still a revision or cluster. Well, revision technically because it's in mesh config, and mesh config is specific to a revision of Istio, not to the entire cluster, but it's never leaking to other clusters. So if I choose to put a label selector and label whatever I want in cluster 1, this will have no impact whatsoever in cluster 2, including on how cluster 2 decides to load balance or to connect to other services, because it will not see the label selectors or the labels in cluster 1. That's the main, and I think Kit, maybe you should answer because there was a lot of confusion and some suggestions that it might cross the cluster boundaries. And before I finish, the other thing I want to make clear, to make sure that we make it very clear in the documentations that, like in the gateway API, when we move from ingress gateway, any label select or anything that is crossing namespace boundaries has risks, and users need to understand that the only safe way to use it is with further admission controllers or other policies, because this gives full control to namespace owners. The only safe way to have strong enforcement that where namespace owner is not really in control of the network and cannot expose random stuff by their own choice is to use the gateway API or other mechanism, not cross namespace label set. Just like ingress in Kubernetes is cross namespace and it's perfectly fine to use if you know what you're doing. But if you want to enforce things, use the gateway API with allow namespace. So it's not an exclusive. Yeah, that's all. Please confirm that we are not crossing cluster boundaries. That's my main. If that's true, then everything else is fine.
You're saying the implication of this setting should be only the local cluster.
As
Am I
with
understanding
everything
right?
else in mesh config, like everything else in mesh config, changing anything in a mesh config and majority of policies and configurations that we have apply to Istio that is running in that cluster and anyone who connects to that Istio. Not a different revision, not a different cluster. The only thing that is crossing cluster boundary is workload entry and the list of 3 or 4 other things that we carefully reviewed for security and discussed a long time, and we still had some security bugs around it. And so if we are not crossing, it is just a normal setting, not a big deal. If we are crossing cluster boundaries, then it's a huge deal.
So I think I can give that a qualified yes. This setting will affect only the services in this cluster being exposed and made available for multi-cluster connectivity. Now, exposing a cluster for multi-connectivity does expose it to clients from other clusters. So it's not meaningless to other clusters, but it's making a decision about the services that live only in this cluster. And then you mentioned about revision. Is mesh config revisioned?
Yeah.
It is. Okay. Then we will make sure that it
It's only
respects revisions as
it's
well.
only exposed to gateways that connect to this, which is fine. It's very good. That's a good feature. But again, every endpoint that you have in the mesh, if you have flat network, is by default this. You can connect to that IP address and you can call any service you want. It's not it's not a protection. I mean, it's the policies and the fact that to create a gateway and expose a service on any kind of gateway doesn't mean that it impacts clients configuration. It just means
Right.
that the client has access to that IP address just like any other IP.
It's effectively service discovery and connectivity.
That's the thing I want to sort of hone in on costing, because I completely agree with everything you said and agree with what Mitch has said. The intent behind this API is that it does not cross the cluster boundary. However, I think it's important that we're clear with users in that single network multi-cluster, you're not going to be able to, like, this will be meaningless basically for single network multi-cluster.
Right.
And that's because unless if COD is going to read endpoints from remote clusters and see them all as global and then send that to data planes to get service discovery.
Not ambient. We're talking about ambient here.
Yeah, an ambient single network, that's what it's going to do. That's all that SCOD knows how to do, is it reads remote endpoints and sends them to the data plane.
Are you sure? Because I'm pretty sure that for ambient, I mean, unless it changed recently, ambient didn't have the same behavior. Didn't, even if you have, ambient is not using the remote endpoints from other clusters in ambient. That was one of the arguments we had.
That's what we're adding, right? That's the purpose of this, right? This that the control plane sees all the remote endpoints and then filters them. Oh, sorry. Let me. Okay, I see your question is yes. We're not sending every single remote endpoint to the data plane, but the control plane. That's the context I'm speaking of here. Let me be more specific. The control plane is going to see every endpoint everywhere.
Regardless, are you saying regardless of the service scope config setting?
Right, because we can't read. Well, so we've got a choice, right? Either the control plane can read every service endpoint from all clusters, or the control plane can apply its local service scope config, which might be confusing for users.
Or it can apply a destination rule and I mean, again, in Istio, even in Istio with sidecar, this is one of the modes which is kind of, not everyone is using that mode and is not intended. Just like we discussed earlier, one is an easy way, which everything is public, everything is watched and so forth. But the other one is a secure mode where you have control in each cluster. You create, workload entry with the IP address of the gateway in the remote cluster. You specify destination rule. You fine tune and control everything. So
right, that's the implication. Like that's the important thing I'm saying we need to call out is that if a customer or a user wants the ability to have their remote cluster service settings be respected, they cannot use single network mode. They need a gateway, because the gateway is going to be the thing that exposes that traffic.
No. To be clear, the intent of the user is one thing, and the implementation is another thing. You can have flat network and have multi. It doesn't matter what kind of network you have, as long as you have network policies and other enforcement to enforce the will of the user. You are
sure.
good.
Yes, you need another mechanism to it, but sort of. My question to make sure we're on the same page here is, if you've got a single cluster, let me just use a scenario. If you have a single cluster, single.
You mean single Istio cover multiple cluster?
That's not quite.
Yep.
Go ahead, Carsten. I didn't hear you start. Go ahead.
So want to separate between user intent, and the API describes how things should work and what is the intent of the user, and the other is implementation. Implementations may have limitations, but if we are saying that this label selector is controlling the exposition, the producer making it possible for clients to connect to that particular service, that's wonderful and that's good. If we are saying that the same API is used across clusters to basically force some clients or to affect other clusters with the label selector in cluster one, is the cluster service. That's a completely different API, completely different story. I mean, there is destination rule and the policies around client control and what the user should see with label selectors that include network and all kinds of other things, with user have full control over where they connect as a client. Even regardless of how network is structured, I mean, it's the intent of the user to load balance across those labels and with the destination rule selectors.
So I get that, but let me paint a scenario, and maybe that'll help the discussion, right? So you've got single network multi-cluster, two clusters in the same network, in the flat network. The user has two different service scope configs in each one of those clusters in a single network. What does the Istio in one of the clusters send to its data plane? Is it based on its local service scope config? Is it using its local service scope config to filter which endpoints, which services are global? Or is it using the remote cluster service scope config to filter which services are global?
So I think I have the answer to that. And maybe this like helps. So like in service exporting across clusters and importing is like fundamentally a service discovery issue. It's not a necessarily a like hard boundary if you can't reach it. It's just discovery. So it happens to be a harder boundary if you have overlapping networks or whatever, and you have like gateways, and it has to go through the gateway as the only ingress point. That makes it so that you can't reach it. But fundamentally, even in a flat network where everything's in the same IP space, it's a service discovery issue. So I think the behavior I would expect as a user is that only services which have been exported, whether through a global flag or a per namespace label or whatever it is, would be included on the remote endpoints for a given service in the local cluster.
Like, how do you know which is exported? Is
But-
it based
but what-
on the? You go first. Scott.
Label that we're already using, right?
Based on the label, right?
So remember that ambient has all the L7 policies enforced in a waypoint or some other gateway. So there is no scenario where you have direct connectivity, even if an endpoint is public on a flat network. In absolutely all cases, the request going to that particular pod, if it's an L7 request, needs to go through some proxy. And we discussed and we agreed that the proxy need to apply the policies in the destination, in the server namespace. So any authorization policy, anything needs to be applied by a proxy. I mean, a waypoint or a east-west gateway combined with waypoint or whatever other combination, there must be a proxy that is programmed with the server-side policies and not with the client-side policies. That's something I hope we are not revisiting. So no matter what, the request will not go flat network or not, will always go to a proxy. Do we agree on that? We are still on the same page?
Yes, though I don't know that that's necessarily what was at issue here, but I don't think we're revisiting that.
Okay.
Lynn, you've got a hand.
Yeah, I have a similar question as you were talking. So the question I have is if probably a little bit more fundamental, like in multi-cluster with sidecar, we support primary remote mode, right? Do we support primary remote down the road for ambient?
Let's not make this discussion because it's already complicated, and that's.
But I want to understand how this configuration applies to your comment about if we do support primary remote, then this configuration would be covered over to the remote cluster, if I understood correctly, unless we don't support that
Yeah.
mode.
So primary remote is not in scope for our initial work. It's not important to our particular use case that we're pursuing. However, this is compatible with primary remote, and we're not doing anything to block that. If that use case is important to someone else in the community, we would welcome a contribution in that direction.
So in that case, I'm thinking for primary remote, this configuration, if I config on the primary, the remote would carry over the configuration. No?
Lynn, primary remote is just a particular way to run where you run Istio. At the end of the day, you have Istio revisions, which may run wherever they want. It doesn't matter where they run. And the real restriction here and the real rule is that an Istio revision gets configs from one cluster, wherever it is. And that config is the scope. I mean, that's really all that the user did that impacts the policy decisions. You know exactly that if you put a authorization policy in cluster 5, that's where Istio is running. If the workloads connect from a different cluster to this Istio, the policy they get is from Istio in cluster 5 and whatever is stored in cluster 5. You can move it to a different cluster. You can run it on a VM. It doesn't matter where Istio per se it's running. So primary remote, it just means, I just don't run a Istio in my own cluster and I don't get configs from my own cluster. I get it from a different cluster.
Right, but we still honor the configuration from the primary clusters. I just want to say in that mode, the configuration would span to multiple cluster because the configuration scope is more than one cluster, right?
But the boundary is still, I mean, the boundary is Istio
boundary
at the end
still
of the cluster. You still have boundaries. It's just the boundaries is you put it in a different place.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just want that to be
This is all about
clarified.
boundaries. I mean, all the discussion we have is
Yeah,
about
yeah,
trust and boundaries, nothing else.
Okay, I think Jackie had her hand for a while too.
Oh yeah, it's kind of in line with your question, Lynn, but I guess Keith, back to your example, were you saying there are multiple mesh configs in your example? Because you were saying, or yeah, multiple service configs, so I'm guessing you meant multiple mesh configs. I thought like kind of a fundamental rule we were holding was that like a cluster will not read a remote cluster's mesh config. I feel like it should just take the responsibility, like it should just refer to its own mesh config as
Always.
its source of truth. So I guess my question to you, Keith, is what are we considering here? What was, because if we're never even looking at the remote cluster's mesh config, I was confused of why there was a confusion around the source of truth, because I feel like there should only be one source of truth for that cluster.
Oh, I completely agree with everything you just said. I'm merely saying that it is
Okay.
something. Maybe I misunderstood what Costin and others were saying before. My point is, we need to make sure we document this for users, because it's not. I don't feel like it is what they would expect, right? I don't know that, like, if they have a service settings export config in one cluster and a different one in a local cluster, they're going to see. The service discovery is going to be based on the local cluster's mesh config and not what the service owner put in the remote cluster. That's the confusing part. That's not intuitive to me.
So your concern is that if users define a service scope config in one mesh config, they'll think it applies to all of their clusters, but it needs, well, depending on if there are multiple mesh configs. So your concern is that's not clearly documented. So they need to maintain consistency between all of their mesh configs for something to be global.
Yes, we should 100% recommend that users keep the service scope config consistent across all clusters, because the clusters that are programming the clients are going to rely on their own mesh configs service settings, not the ones in the remote cluster. I'm not proposing changing how we do things architecturally. Okay. I'm saying that this is not intuitive for users, and we should document best practices and let them know that this could be messy for them.
And don't forget, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to weigh in. I 100% agree with that. The amount of confusion we generate ourselves shows, if user happens to keep the mesh configuration for service setting different across multiple clusters, they're going to get it wrong, like what we spent in the last 20 minutes discussing this topic. So 100% agree. We definitely recommend user to keep them consistent, even though the configuration doesn't span across boundary, but it's a best practice for simplicity.
And speaking of confusion, even among ourselves, I mean, we are a security product after all. Remember, the ingress gateway was deprecated because it has this problem where cross namespace boundary was no longer respected with ingress, and we had to have gateway with our own namespace to preserve, because it's as a namespace owner, you can put whatever labels you want. Nobody stops you from putting labels. As a cluster or a gateway admin, you cannot trust that the namespace is putting the labels you expect. Across cluster is even worse. So if you have a label selector in cluster 1 that make decision about workloads in cluster 2 that may use whatever labels that's a big problem, big security problem. So it's fine. I mean, if you are in the original Istio where everything is completely flat equivalent and you don't have any kind of delegation, you are basically one entity that controls everything. You are producing the applications, you certify that they are correct, you put the labels, everything is controlled by you, it's good. But if you have some third-party application you get from Helm, from some random dude that may change the Helm chart to put arbitrary labels, they can suddenly intercept traffic that is not intended to, so they can bypass the policy. It's not a trust enforcement mechanism, the label. So we need alternative mechanisms for people who want to have full control, like we had with Istio Classic, with Sidecar, where you just disable the cross namespace watchers, you put, wait workload entries, and you have a secure mode where you tightly control everything that is accessed.
So, Costin, I heard a few things there that I think maybe merit further conversation. In most models where you have a multi-tenant cluster and various namespace owners, the namespace owner does not own the labels of their own namespace. That namespace creation and labeling actually has to happen by a cluster administrator, because you can't grant write access to a single namespace object at a time. So the
selector is for
labels are
services.
controlled centrally, not
No,
by
but,
the.
but this is a service label API, Mitch. It's not enablement
Sure,
for
service labels, you're right, are controlled by the namespace.
Yep.
And so that would be a decision that you would need to make as a cluster operator. Maybe you're looking for a service with label X in a namespace that is also labeled that way. That's
That's
totally
not
something
supported.
that you can express in this model.
I don't think so. That API doesn't have a namespace plus. It doesn't have a namespace operator on top of it.
It does. So the namespace within a single service scope, or let's see here.
They're
Okay,
ORed, aren't they?
I'm struggling
I
to
thought they
read
were
the object. Each entry in this is meant to be a tuple of service selector and namespace selector. The service is exported if any of the tuples both match. So you can specify service selector and namespace selector in a single tuple, and that will limit. Now, if you have other entries, those are ORed. So you're ANDed within a single tuple, you're ORed across the array of tuples. So that is totally expressible. Now, that being said, the way it's written here, there's a list of service scopes. I think maybe we need to move the list down to the service, down to the selector level.
Mitch,
But I can work with Jackie.
Even that would be true, which is basically equivalent to allow namespace in the gateway API, which is basically, if you use gateway APIs, that's effectively what you get. You get the tuple of, you select the namespace and then you have the label selector inside the namespace effectively, well, which is delegated. But remember, it's fine for exposing gateway because it's local to a cluster. If you are talking about a cluster as a boundary, which is a stronger boundary than namespace in general, then you no longer trust anything in the other cluster. I mean, the fact that the other cluster can create a namespace with any label is a different admin. It's basically a different entity that controls that cluster. You cannot express anything. So the further you go down the boundaries, the more strict it needs to be basically.
By definition, you trust the other cluster, Costin. That's what namespace sameness means.
No,
It's the definition of multi-cluster, and it's fundamental to everything Istio has ever been in the multi-cluster space.
That's not it. So there are plenty of customers who have, for example, one cluster where they run the application X, where they say security or billing. It's only in cluster one. No other cluster is allowed to have namespaces, and because they control the configs and they don't do automatic. They make sure that billing is only in trusted cluster, which has 5 admins that are working on billing, and no random dude on a different cluster can create a billing application in that cluster. It's very common to not trust all clusters equally.
Custom, right? Like Mitch is correct here. Like, let's be clear, right? If you do shared control plane discovery, you are relying on the feature of namespace sameness. If you don't want namespace sameness, you can use the federation feature of directly publishing workload entry and service entry, and not register the cluster for discovery, right? That is the existing consistent behavior we have done. Namespace feature is even a feature of MCS, right? Like the Kubernetes feature relies on namespace sameness, right? So we allow for both. But the truth is, in most customers' custom, cluster is often not the actual boundary, right? Cluster is just an infrastructural boundary that exists for convenience because people can't scale up or scale down the workloads.
I don't disagree with you.
Right, that's the most common pattern, in fact.
It is definitely the most common pattern. Most people do not care about those details and security.
Right.
That's reality.
Yeah. So we have an option for people who want what we would call snowflakes, right, which is special kinds of services that they want to make available, but they don't want universal discovery for them, which is go through workload entry and service entry.
Wait, that's pretty much what I said. That's what I said. I mean, there are 2 modes. One is when you have gateway API plus, say, workload entry plus service entry plus other things, and then you have these label selectors, which again needs to be within.
Right, and you actually register the other cluster for discovery.
Yep.
Yeah, one of those is multi-cluster officially. The other is using multiple meshes across multiple clusters with federation.
Both of them are multi-cluster. Let's not take the word
Yeah,
multi-cluster.
we should probably just call it federation
Okay,
or
Federated
ad hoc
multi-
ad hoc
Federation is
federation.
another word that means something else. I mean, we have used it with different.
Yeah, we gotta be a little
clusters
careful with the
and-
whole the
Yeah.
yeah,
X509.
they both use multiple clusters, but within the Istio project, when we refer to multi-cluster, we're referring to a single mesh that spans multiple clusters.
That is what we usually refer to.
That can be implemented in different ways to different ways. So generally, if I think our definition, if it has a single set of root CAs, it's considered single. Anyway,
Oh,
we know
we
what
should
we're
get
talking about.
we should get to Tyler. He's had a hand up for a while.
Good call, Jackie.
Hi, folks. Thanks for taking my question. Yeah, I had left the original comments on this just to sort of echo what Costin was saying. The way we do this is we have multi-tenant clusters that run a wide variety of different trust levels of workloads. Workload owners get a namespace. Everything that they put inside their namespace is up to them. Istio and Service Mesh is managed by a different team. So really any API that allows us to interact with the thing in the namespace without mutating the namespace is a suitable API. Anything that requires someone to add a label, say to a service they deploy or something like that, is a really difficult API for us to implement. And it sounds like the way forward, if we want to pick up ambient, is probably very similar to what we're doing with Sidecar today with duplicating workload entries and service entries, and just disabling discovery. I had kind of hoped that there would be like if you were to make this a separate resource, right, like a service discovery selector resource, that actually is something that we could RBAC securely, but we couldn't use this with labels. And I think many other people in a multi-tenant situation with a variety of trust levels where we don't actually trust the service owner to manage their own networking, I think this would be like a prohibitive API. And if that's the design decision, that's fine. And I said that in my original comment, but I just wanted to surface like there's a lot of us who won't be able to use something like this and we'll have to not use discovery.
So I appreciate that feedback. That's really good for us to know and to consider when designing this. I do think that the workload entry, service entry approach will still work, and I just actually got to a checkpoint in the test today that confirmed that the ambient implementation works with the exact same tests for sidecars. So in single cluster, so that's good news. I'm curious if you deployed a validating admission policy for the cluster that prevented service owners from adding the labels that you set in the mesh config, and then had an allow list of services that were able to make their clusters global. Would that be useful for you? Would that maybe allow you to adopt this API?
Well, that would probably be the first thing I would do, right? If I was going to pick up this API is write that validating admissions policy. I already have a bunch of policies that look like that for various resources. The problem is that every time I add another one of those, right, that's another component that needs to scale when we think about starting up bootstrapping a cluster after, say, a event where we're restoring from backup. That is another point of failure that we have to consider, whether or not those policies fail open, fail closed, tends to trigger a wide set of discussions from many concerned stakeholders. So we try to offload things out of admission webhooks as much as we can.
Gotcha. That's helpful. I'll say we did some. I was talking with Jackie about this, I think yesterday. I had some light discussion about another CRD for doing this. And while it would be possible, it does become for one. You could design it such a way where it's very similar to this mesh config API, but we tend to be fairly hesitant to add new CRDs in Istio because of the ongoing maintenance cost of that CRD. But I definitely take the use case. I think what we could maybe do is deploy, not deploy, but sort of document a policy for doing this, and maybe how you could, instead of having multiple policies, you could maybe have a slice of resources in the cell configuration for the different services. But really appreciate you bringing the use case. I think Louis and Costin have something they want to add.
Yeah, Tyler, I just want to check a few things, right? So, right, there's obviously the kind of composed permission model question here, right? Like, if there's a few different views of the world here and you want to be able to support both of them, right? One is admins give permission to service owners to be able to make their services global. Service owners decide if their service should be global or not. The second one, and I think it's the one you're describing, is the admin picks completely whether the service is global or not, and the service owner does not. You're talking about the latter, right?
That's yeah, I think that's fine to discuss. It's a little bit more complicated of a workflow. Service owner requests, security admin approves,
Okay,
mesh
so there's a
control plane
workflow.
reconciles. Yeah.
Okay, but
There's a
there's a
business
workflow.
workflow.
Yeah, that eventually materializes into the infrastructure, not the service owner
Correct.
definition gets materialized.
And this is part of where Sidecar is really powerful for us because the APIs are just selecting things, right? So it's fine for us to write those APIs into the user's namespace. They don't even know that they're there. But we're just selecting things that are already there as opposed to saying add this special label and we're going to mutate your service to add this label upon promotion, right? To be multi-cluster, for example.
Right. So the question and the thought that occurred in my head is there is a standardized Kubernetes label for resource names. And I don't know if we've tested this API with it. And that API, right. So that API would allow you to directly refer to the resource done in that way.
So it's funny that you bring that up because when I filed my initial comment on Sunday, I fact checked that because that's what I was going to say I could use if I was going to do this. The problem is that is for namespaces. It is only conventional for services. It's not actually populated for services, which is really, really annoying. But even if we were going to do this for services, writing all of this into mesh config, eventually you're going to overflow. Like imagine I have thousands of services in a single cluster, right? That mesh config is stored in etcd. It's like anything else. It has the default value size of what 1.5 megabytes. Like eventually I'm going to run out of space there.
So yeah, I agree. There's a space problem with the CRD, right? And so like we'll have to test the scale, right? Clearly, but the problem, right, and like something looking like the gateway API, right, and where you say target ref this service is global, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a policy attachment point. That will have to live in some other namespace for which we would have to establish a standard. We could say Istio system or something along those lines, because you don't want that resource to be observable by the service owner namespace, right? So that would be the alternative API that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that would actually be fine for us because we would just RBAC that resource off from the
service
owner.
No, that's
right.
It could be done a variety of different ways. I think if we were to create a CR, that is the form that it would take. I think the question then becomes, like, for a very large percentage of the user base, labeling is just fine, right? In fact, it's preferred in many cases as a marker for things, right? Obviously in Kubernetes, they have fostered that property and pushed it into the thought process of many people for a very long time. Whether it's, which things I want to observe, right? Using OTel labels to control what telemetry is being scraped, right? This happens all the time in Kubernetes, right? So there's going to be some tension between your use case and possibly the rest of the ecosystem here that we're going to have to evaluate to decide what's the right UX. I take your point about the label being a headache for this kind of strict partitioned multi-tenancy pure admin control as opposed to composed authority models.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to have to take a long, hard look at the use case to decide, right, what is the best UX in aggregate, and if we have to have a compensating measure for something else.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. That's totally fair.
So for time reasons, I'd like to ask if we can move to the next thing. It seems like we've kind of covered this thoroughly. I would ask Tyler if we could get more details on your use case. It sounds fascinating and could be informative for more than just our multi-cluster design discussions.
What,
So
what,
I think, like, to be clear, I think Tyler's use case is perfectly valid, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's a different authority model, right? So, like, I don't want to pretend, like, just because we got to him last, I'm not sure we're actually done, Mitch. I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
And I want to remind people that this kind of CRD exists. It was designed exactly for use case like this, which is very common, and we discussed the land. It's called Gateway API. It has everything that we need. Allow namespace, rules. And it's what you have to use if you want to expose the service on the internet anyway. So I
Well,
think
Gateway API in this case, Custom, is actually the reverse of what Tyler's asking. Gateway API is designed to control being the attachment point and giving a delegated authority model to somebody else. What Tyler's asking for here is saying, I don't want to give them any authority. I want something that looks like a policy attachment, right? So target ref equals, let's say, namespace or service.
No. You have the gateway in the east-west gateway namespace. You have HTTP routes. You RBAC, or you don't even have to RBAC. I mean, that I'm not saying that each service creates a gateway, but the administrator of the east-west gateway has a gateway, HTTP routes, and the mechanism to delegate. That's pretty standard, and
Right, but
there's no different
the point Tyler's saying here, he doesn't want to delegate.
You don't delegate anything. With a gateway, you don't have to delegate. You allow namespaces, allows you to delegate. You don't allow namespaces, you control
No, but
all
the
routes.
service that wants to be global is in a namespace,
Yeah.
and he doesn't want to delegate any authority to them, so they can't refer to anything.
They don't refer to
Makes
anything. The tenant doesn't do anything. The tenant just have a service, a regular service. They file a ticket or whatever. The admin, the owner of the security, create an HTTP route in the east-west gateway pointing to the service in namespace X, in the tenant namespace. The user doesn't do anything in their namespace. Doesn't.
Oh, so I think, leaving aside the HTTP route detail, Custom, I think what you're saying is, instead of having an implicit east-west gateway, we have a fully explicit one
Explicit, exactly.
with a specific route type.
Which works perfectly because it's a standard configuration. You don't need a custom. It's just you create routes.
No,
in that
I think
particular.
we might actually need a custom one. HTTP. I'm not sure HTTP route will actually work, or TCP route. I think they have to be something else. But like, just leaving that aside for the moment, there's a route type, like a gamma route type, right, or something along those lines, that says, I am an east-west gateway. I am going to connect to this service. Okay, now that means that I'm federated. Right, or sorry, I will perform the routing. Now we still have to decide what's going to perform the discovery. And we'd have to look, the Istio would have to look at that east-west gateway and say, oh, those are the things that are now made accessible.
Yes, and there are some controllers
yeah.
that need to be implemented and automation, but in general, I know it works because there are people using this pattern. And
Yeah, no, I think that is a fair point.
It's not new. It's working perfectly even outside of Istio. You don't even need Istio to implement this kind of model, and so it's well established. I know it's easier with Istio, it's better with Istio, whatever, but it's not.
If we're going to make Tyler happy and he's using Istio, then it would need to be done by Istio.
And it is done with Istio. This pattern has been done with Istio for years now. It's not new. It's not nothing special. Nothing. You just need to use the raw APIs and controls.
So Tyler, just a thought, like leaving aside the implementation detail of what the route type actually is. So imagine there's a gateway resource that says, I'm an east-west gateway for global services, and this are the explicitly routed services. Then that would entirely take that definition out of the infrastructure, out of the service owner universe, and would compose the way the gateway API composed. With that, I think that would scale, should scale, right? Because each route can be an independent thing. You know, you'll have one route per service that you want to make global, but that would define that topology.
One route per service that I want to make global, or one route per service route that I want to make global?
One route per service that you want to make global. So it's effectively a decorator for the service.
Yeah.
But
At first glance,
that's
that's a much better UX for me. Again, this is just for me. I recognize that my needs are not the average user's needs, and Istio does not need to cater to what I am doing.
I think like Custom, the general point about using the gateway API, we can, right? Custom brings up a very good point here, and I think he's probably right, actually, as that's the best way to do it, leaving aside what route type. for a hot second. I think that's probably a good approach, and we should capture that in the design as an alternative and explore it a little bit.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
A 5-minute time check. We did have another topic on the agenda that we probably want to get to.
Yes.
So, hi, I'm Joey. So, yeah, I'm trying to verify this very basic things because, like, when you enable the ambient mode, we mentioned, oh, the MTOS is enabled automatically, and we have this web page saying all bunch of different ways to verify MTOS is enabled. They're all really good. Actually, yeah, I was able to follow the page to verify them, but I want a kind of a deterministic way to verify it, like use TCP dump. I mean, there's a TCP dump section at the end. Personally, I think it's not sufficient to approve because in the doc it says if you see the TCP dump output, if it's encrypted, then it could indicate MTOS, but I think it can only indicate the traffic is encrypted, right? But we cannot make sure it is MTOS because if we use simple TOS, the traffic is also encrypted. And that's the reason I tried to, yeah, so in the document, it suggests the net shoot image, which is really powerful. So what I tried to do here is I have a cluster, has a namespace, which is ambient enabled, and I also use the waypoint. And I create a net shoot pod and try to just curl that product page, which is from the sample application service. So in the meanwhile, I use term shock to get the TCP dump. So here's the screenshot. And at top 3 is simple TOS handshake, and then you can see client hello and the server hello. But what I did not find is normally for MTOS, the server should request the client cert, right? But I did not find from here. I'm not sure whether I miss anything here.
So is your net shoot in ambient?
Yeah. I just use net shoot. I just try to create a curl request. And I just try to use the term shock, from it to capture the TCP dump.
I'm wondering
so
if...
just be super clear here. You said you were expecting to see something beyond server hello and client hello?
Yeah. Because
this is TLS 1.3 with ECDHE. In 1.2, yes, maybe, but not in 1.3, I don't think.
So you mean, okay, so these are like server request client.
Right, like this is like TLS fast open.
Okay.
Right, where one of the round trips is elided.
So
because it's 1.3.
I see. So it's because of the version issue. So I suppose not be able to see it. Yeah. Okay.
Right. TLS 1.3 eliminated one round trip in a situation that we take advantage of deliberately to improve the TLS open speed.
I see. Cool. And yeah, thank you for the explanation. I still think that the community doc, I think I could try to improve a bit. Yeah, I try to think about some ways besides, from TCP dump output, besides we see encrypted traffic, whether we have some ways to verify it.
Yeah, if you can submit a PR to clarify, I think I might wrote some of the doc initially. Feel free. because from our perspective, we were more focused on the traffic is encrypted, and we also have many other ways to check the key
Okay.
words.
Yeah. So like and it's just kind of like an inherent tension with the goals of the TLS specification and what you're trying to do in some ways. What do you actually want to know?
Like my original goal is, okay, so it's MTOS. I supposed to see the TOS handshake in the TCP dump. I just try to see this event happen.
Right. Okay. So
yeah.
like what you're seeing client hello and server hello is what you should expect to see in TLS 1.3.
Okay.
And then the question is, if you wanted to see more information about what was in the client hello and server hello, what would you like to see? And just understand that as TLS progresses, you see less and less over time, right? Like,
yeah. I think your explanation answered my questions. Since it's 1.3, it's just one less communication, yeah, I suppose not be able to see it. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, Stephen, do you want to weigh in quickly?
Yeah, I just want to add, like, if you really want to see it, like I like to see it because it makes me happy sometimes, is from the client you can also dump your TLS keys. There are usually various ways to do it, and then you can import them into Wireshark, and then everything is decrypted.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Specifically,
sorry, if you need a hand, you can let me know.
Yeah, I was going to say we have a client for Istio that can do HBone and double HBone natively. While designing and building some of the multi-cluster stuff, I actually used this method. You just add a couple lines of Go code to spit the session. I forget what the API is called, but it's like session keys or what have you. You can spit them to local and then feed that into Wireshark to see the entire request payload. So if it's just like a validation thing, if you want to record a video or whatever, like we can definitely contribute to docs. We'll take a contribution to docs to show users how to do that.
Yeah, cool, thanks. Yeah, it is a validation. It's more like a validation thing. Yeah, cool. Thank you for the help. That's all my questions.
yeah, Stephen, the Wireshark stuff, that is actually quite useful. If you have some bandwidth, maybe send a note about that. We could incorporate into the docs.
Okay.
That is the way to get the most information about the handshake. You're correct, Oral. Even there, right, that is something TLS is trying to defeat, if I remember correctly. I don't think we are using the modes of TLS that would attempt to defeat that. But so it will work, because we're not trying to, well, I'm not going to go into nation state actor stuff at this point. But yeah, yes, that is literally the best way to do it, to get the most information about what's happening in the key exchange.
While we are on the topic, something I've considered before is, if we're compiling in debug mode, just have it pick up on SSL keylog file and automatically log the keys there. I'll just quickly, if anybody has strong thoughts. Yeah, that's kind of the face I made when I thought about this.
I'm imagining if somebody accidentally ships a debug build to production.
The terror becomes very, very real at that point. Yeah, I think we would, and we deliberately make it hard to get the keys out of the containers too, right? There's also that. So keys are not easy to get to do what you're trying to do here, Jerry. But that is, yeah, like we want keys to be ephemeral, right? We want the private keys to only reside in memory, never be written to disk, like all of that jazz. So yes, there's very much a, yes, it would have to be a very well protected feature, Stephen.
Okay, so maybe
like maybe even to the level of you use a different CA.
Okay, so maybe seems like a lot of trouble. At that point, you might as
I
well
think
just,
that's a feature, not a bug. Like you want something like this to be a lot of trouble to do, because you're intentionally trying to violate the security guarantees of one of the most foundational protocols on the internet. So I do agree that it's useful for us or people who are really wanting to validate it. Like the recommendation for, like, if I'm telling somebody how to test this in enterprise, I'm telling them to create a whole new cluster that can only stick around for less than 30 days, make it an alpha cluster, like tear it, like you don't want this accidentally getting to prod in any sort of way. And you're going to want to put guarantees in place to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, like anything we do to make it easy to get the key out of a container is just inherently a security risk.
Okay, so maybe just on docs or on a wiki entry or this and that.
Yeah. The only other thing I could think of is that you use the waypoint model to do it, and we build a TCP, not a man in the middle, right? But it's a logging waypoint that logs the TLS handshake that you could use to just inspect flows and to dump all the properties of the flow. Then you could explicitly opt into it, and it wouldn't violate any security model because the waypoint itself would have an identity. It wouldn't exfiltrate any keys. It would just log stuff. But then we have ztunnel doing that, so why not just have ztunnel log more info? So Jayway, the other option, and it's perfectly reasonable here, is just, dear ztunnel, can you log more information about the handshake? Obviously not log the keys, but log more stuff so I can see more about what the handshakes are. Because it can absolutely do that. That's fine.
I see. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I can try maybe modify the ztunnel code and build customize ztunnel, try to explore the output more information. Yeah.
Yeah, that would give you by far the most detail, and then if you make that a reasonable like environment variable or flag control feature of ztunnel, it can go upstream.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the suggestions. I think that makes sense. Yeah. That's all my questions.
All right, I think Mitch had to drop, and it looks like we're over time. But really appreciate the conversation today. I think it was a great time.
Yeah, thanks for all the feedback.
Cheers.
Thank you.